Hi, my name's Chuck Pazeshki. I'm the Director of Industrial Engagement at the Voiland College of Engineering and Architecture, Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. And today I'm going to talk about how we manage complexity in organizations and design. The title of the talk is Empathy, Design, and Technological Advance, Understanding the Power of Connection and Creating Breakthrough Innovation in Technology. So let's start with a couple of quotes to get ourselves thinking about this. The first is, if there's a Buddha higher than Buddha, it is not Buddha. And the second is, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. That's by a more familiar face, Albert Einstein. So what does the first one mean? Well, it said that the great Buddha was sitting around one day and one of his followers came up and said, is there anybody more enlightened than you? And so he thought about it and he goes, well, there might be somebody more enlightened than me, but it's not me. So the second quote, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it, by Albert Einstein, is really along the same lines. So if we have, right now we're in the middle of this incredible technological shift. And of course, technology has helped us solve a lot of problems. But the problems of technology itself can't necessarily be solved by technology. And that's what Albert Einstein was trying to get at, is that we have to go to another level, just like the Buddha told us. We've got to go to another level in order to solve the problems that we see today. And so what I'm going to argue about is argue for rather, is the understanding of empathy and how that works in helping us solve these higher level problems. So we're going to start with an animation that's kind of very, very interesting. So here we go. And it's about plane accident.
On August 20th, 2007, a Boeing 737-800 operated by China Airlines departed from Taiwan and had an uneventful flight to Naha Airport, Okinawa, Japan. The 737-800 employs a high-lift system that includes leading-edge slats which enhance takeoff and landing performance. These slats move on tracks, which retract into the wing leading edge until contact with the downstop assembly. When retracted, the slat tracks are stored in housings which are only large enough to accommodate the slat track. The track housing itself is an integrated part of the wing fuel tank and extends through the front spar into the main fuel tank. Approximately a month prior to the accident, the number 5 slat can had been inspected and reworked in accordance with a fleet-wide Boeing service letter. It was believed by investigators that a washer had been omitted during reassembly following this maintenance activity. The bolt assembly can be seen here as part of the downstop. The washer was intended to prevent the bolt assembly from passing through the downstop, since the nut is smaller than the hole in the downstop assembly. Investigators believe that at some time between the earlier maintenance action and this flight, the bolt assembly migrated out of the downstop assembly and fell into the slat track housing. With the bolt assembly lying inside the track housing, upon slat retraction, the track pushed the bolt assembly through the bottom of the housing, penetrating the main fuel tank, which resulted in a fuel tank breach. Leaking fuel migrated to the leading edge of the wing and was carried aft by airflow during airplane taxi. This photo was taken from the penetrated fuel tank after the accident occurred. As shown, the entire bolt assembly was driven into the fuel tank. After arriving at the designated parking position, leaking fuel began pooling beneath the aircraft. Ground personnel observed this leaking fuel coming from the right side of the aircraft and immediately contacted the flight crew via the cockpit interphone system, advising them of the situation. During taxi, and while the engine was still running at idle, leaking fuel was not able to reach the hot engine tailpipe or brakes, as the cool engine fan exhaust prevented fuel migration at these hot areas. Upon engine shutdown, the fuel was able to drip onto the tailpipe of the engine and onto the hot brakes, resulting in ignition. Flames then quickly spread back to the aircraft, which was eventually completely destroyed by the fire. The airplane was successfully evacuated at the first indication of fire. There were no fatalities or serious injuries. The first picture shows the aircraft during the fire. The second picture shows the number 5 slat track housing following the fire.
All right, so you can see right away that this is obviously a very, very interesting problem. I mean, here you have a 737 that's made of about 600,000 parts, a Chinese airline, or it's actually a Taiwanese airline, Japanese maintenance crew, resulted in the loss of the aircraft, but actually everybody got out alive. So that's not too bad. But at the same time, we want to try to figure out, one washer basically caused an entire aircraft to burn. What is the most effective corrective action? So, do you fire the Japanese maintenance company? I mean, hey, after all, they were the ones that made the mistake. Not buy any more 737s. Got to wonder if there's some more problems deep inside that. Except, got to also remember that 737 is the most popular passenger aircraft in existence. Punish, fire, treat as a criminal the maintenance tech. How would you conduct an investigation? What would you do to try to find out what's going on? All right, well, so now let's talk about some first principles. The first thing you have to do is realize you're swimming. Okay, so what does this mean? So there's a story by David Foster Wallace, The Two Fish, the old fish and the young fish. And the old fish is swimming along. It says, the water's warm today. And the young fish says, what's water? And that's kind of the way it is with empathy. Basically, humans are empathetic creatures, and they're wired very, very deeply for coordinated behavior. But the roots of empathy go way, way, way back. And there's actually breakdown into a nice pyramid that I've kind of added onto that was originally put up by Franz de Waal, who's kind of a famous empathy researcher. And here we have 3 problem-solving velociraptors around a Diabloceratops. And the way that they're going to manage to eat that Diabloceratops is through coordinated action. So emotional empathy is the next level up. We're very familiar with that. In fact, that's probably what most people think of when you say empathy. It's kind of feeling through the experience. And there's, me with my son when he was very young, sitting next to a mountain lake. And then, the fact is that emotional empathy can even transcend species. Nothing like a little puppy and a boy. Rational empathy is something that we try to develop with our students in my clinic. And the idea here is that it's perspective taking of the different people so that they can look at what a customer's needs are and attempt to design a solution that satisfies those needs, as opposed to what they believe they want in a more egocentric perspective. And then there's lastly on the top of the pyramid, which is a whole brain phenomenon. Linked whole brain is what I call global empathy. And one of the things interesting about empathy that I've discovered is that basically you can only perceive as much as you are enlightened enough to perceive. So I'm not going to claim a whole lot of ground on global empathy. But here's an easy example. There's the Dalai Lama in the middle. That guy's probably got more global empathy going on than I do. But perspective taking on a massive scale really does matter as far as temporal and spatial scales. And so on the left is a picture of the globe, more an ancient picture. And then, of course, on the right with the clouds is a picture from the International Space Station. And what's interesting was that until spaceflight started to occur, every time we had a representation of the globe, it actually never had any clouds. So perspective definitely matters as far as the reach of our ability to connect. When we take all these things and put them together, then we have what I call the empathy pyramid. And like I said, Franz de Waal came up with the bottom 3 layers here. I added the global empathy. And on the top, and the key element here is that actually these are all nested inside each other. So what happens as we go up in empathy is we have increasing temporal, spatial scales, resources, energy, and responsibility. The more connected we are, the more responsible we feel. And then, of course, the way that it also works is that the number of people who actually embody those things go down. Basically, everybody's got mirroring behaviors. there's some large subset of the population that has emotional or what's often called affective empathy, rational empathy less so, and global empathy even less so. So instead of talking about so many complicated levels, sometimes it's useful just to talk about low empathetic versus evolved empathetic systems. And here's what's really important here. So a low level empathetic relational environment basically has what we call a simplex channel. And a simplex channel is information goes one way. And we all know this if you have a bossy boss. Simplex channels are low trust, they're externally defined. You listen to the boss because he or she's your boss. And at some level, they're also a low responsibility. And this is the interesting thing. In a very authoritarian system, you're supposed to do what the boss says. But if the boss doesn't tell you anything to do, then you're allowed to sit there. And if somebody says, why aren't you doing anything? You can say, well, the boss didn't tell me what to do. So actually, simplex channel low empathy systems actually promote passivity among the participants. And that's a really, really interesting concept. Now, in evolved empathetic relational environments, you have two-way communication. You have a duplex channel. And then the emphasis is on coherence. So did I hear you? It's high trust. When somebody comes to you, they tell you something, you develop trust because you have the ability to talk back and you know. Okay, so instead of considering all the different levels, sometimes it's interesting or a little bit easier to understand if we consider a simple dichotomy. Low empathetic versus evolved empathetic systems. So what do we mean by that? Well, what's the big discriminator? So for low-level empathetic relational environments, we have what we call a simplex channel. Information goes one way. So if you have a boss that's a bossy boss, they tell you what to do, and that's what you're supposed to do. Low trust, you just do what you're supposed to do, which means you have very, very little agency, and so you can't really trust because that's not what it's about. It's defined externally. Your boss is your boss. You don't really have much say in it. And what that actually yields is interesting. It kind of turns into a low responsibility environment. Because whereas in an authoritarian system, the boss gets to tell you what to do, when the boss isn't telling you what to do, you just get to sit there. And so these simplex channel low empathy systems actually create passivity in how people execute their duties. So they're not responsible unless the boss is telling them to do something. Now contrast that with evolved empathetic relational environments. Here you have a duplex channel, which means that you talk back. And so you might have a boss, but what's important is that you actually understand them. And so then coherence starts becoming important and trust matters. So, if they're telling you to do something, you try to figure out if they're really telling you to do it based on high trust. Relationships in duplex channel systems are independently generated. So you're allowed to go out and you have enough agency to go out and make your own friends and figure out who you're going to do stuff with. And of course, when you do that, then you start having high responsibility as well, because then you establish larger agency and more ownership. So let's think about hierarchical environments, through the game of telephone, the childhood game of telephone. The message is relayed very quick, but the problem is low information coherence. So let's start here down at the bottom with the woman figure on the left and see what it takes for her to talk to the man on the right. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in order to have these two communicate with each other. And so if it's a simplex line, you can imagine how things are going to get garbled. So it's quick, but very, very low information coherence. As opposed to independent relationships, they take longer. Nothing is free. The laws of thermodynamics still apply. You still need more energy and so on and so forth, but higher information coherence. You have agents, they go around, they talk to each other, they figure out how much, they read faces, very, very big with empathy. Why does this matter for product design? Okay, well, there's this thing. It's called Conway's Law, and Melvin Conway was a famous Silicon Valley programmer back in the 60s, and in 1967 he coined this law, and it was almost kind of a joke. And what it said was organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. So the bottom line is that social structure creates design structure. So I was sitting around one day and I was scratching my head and I go, what's that arrow in the middle? And I invented this thing called the intermediate corollary. And I said, well, don't you have to know what you're going to build before you build it? Well, if that's the case, social structure maps to knowledge structure, which then maps to design structure. And so what this tells us is how we socially interact directly creates the knowledge structure that creates our designs. And even more important, social structure mapping to knowledge structure says the level of empathy in the social structure maps to the level of synergy in the knowledge structure, and the type of empathy relates to the level of information coherence. So this is true for companies, organizations, societies, nations. The levels of empathy and independent relational generation map to the levels of synergy, creativity, innovation in your organization. So getting back to that burning airplane, if you don't want to avoid that and make high-tech project with millions of parts, then you have to have empathy, because there's tons and tons and tons of information exchange pieces that you simply can't get your error rates low enough without empathy. You can't do it with a simplex system. And this is true for entire social systems. There's this famous problem called Needham's dilemma, why the West outdistanced China in the Industrial Revolution. And the answer that I came up with was basically it's all about empathy. So what happened in American or in Western social societies is that basically we started valuing the individual more. And as we valued the individual more, we basically had to create empathy. That empathy allowed us to exchange information to create more complex mechanical systems, which then fired the Industrial Revolution. Meanwhile, China sat mired with narcissistic authoritarian emperors who were put on pedestals basically as gods themselves. It wasn't that Chinese people weren't plenty smart, because they are, but their form of information exchange was extremely limited. And then the greatest example of how empathy basically can revolutionize an industrial culture that I like is W. Edwards Deming in manufacturing in Japan. So statistical quality control is what Deming brought, but the reality is what he really did was he flipped the hierarchy in Japanese industry. So there's upward and downward information flow for manufacturing. He eliminated the blame the worker for inherent defects and proved that it's not about culture or race, it's actually about social organization. So I hope you've enjoyed this little slideshow. This is a start to a lot of the stuff that's on my blog. Happy reading, and don't hesitate to leave comments.